guys, welcome back to Frankie's Forest. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to repot an orchid, specifically a Phalaenopsis orchid. However, this method, or this way of repotting, can pretty much work with all orchids. The only thing that differs is their root structure and the way that their leaves are shaped, the way that their leaf structure is, their stem structure. But the basic principles of repotting pretty much relate to every orchid. So as you notice with my Phalaenopsis here, it is dormant. When you repot your orchid, you want it to be dormant. You never want to have an orchid that has a flower spike on it, because that flower spike could go in shock, and there's a very good chance that it actually won't produce any flowers or even buds if it hasn't gotten to that stage. If it is, or if it's totally flowered ready, no buds left, occasionally I will repot if I think it's absolutely necessary. However, I usually like to leave the repotting until when my orchid is dormant, when it doesn't have any flowers, and when it's just focusing all its energy on growing leaves. So with that being said, the first thing I want to do is take the orchid out of the pot. As you can see, my orchid has a lot of aerial roots, a wonderful root structure, really magnificent. And it just came right out of the pot on its own. I didn't keep it in this because there wasn't a drainage hole, so I kept it in a plastic pot that I put inside of here. So what you'll want next is a pair of scissors that are sterilized. The reason you want sterilized scissors is because you don't want the roots to get, if you cut off any bad roots, you don't want any of the other roots to touch that and then get an infection if this scissor if you cut it. If you used it to cut something else. So the way to sterilize it is you can either run it under really hot water for a couple seconds, or just wipe it with some rubbing alcohol. That can work as well, or isopropyl alcohol. So the next step, and this is probably the most tedious step, but the most worth it step. So you want to take your old pot and just start picking out all of the moss. This can take a little while, but by picking out all of the old moss, it kind of gives your orchid's roots some more air, kind of aerates them a bit more, as well as by removing this moss, and we're actually going to be putting new moss in. Every time we repot an orchid, we want to use fresh growing media. We don't want to justify it by saying, well, we're putting it in a bigger pot, so we don't really need new growing media this time. But no, whichever way it goes, you always want new growing media, because the one you have can kind of decompose over time. And as you can see, this actually it's super easy to just break apart. Normal moss wouldn't really be that easy to break apart. It's kind of more firm. So yeah, you'll want to start out by removing all of the moss. So I'll time lapse that for you guys. Alright, so once you have removed as much as the moss or growing media as possible, you'll want to take this under a sink and rinse it off in case there is anything on the roots that could potentially damage it. When you rinse it off, you want to make sure not to get any water in the crown of the orchid. The crown is right where the leaves come out of, the middle of the orchid. If you're interested in crown rot, I actually have a video on my channel about what crown rot is and how to avoid it. So why don't you go check that out if you're interested. All right, I'll go under the sink now and rinse this off. All right, I just finished rinsing off the orchid. As you can see, we can see all of the roots much clearer now. So the next step is to take your scissors and go through the root structure and try to find dead roots. So the way you do this is if you see any roots like this, right? They're like papery, they're brown and, or black, or even, they could even be like kind of beige sometimes. You'll want to take those off. Usually they'll be papery, sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll still be somewhat alive, but they might have a disease or something. So you want to just cut them off, and I'll show you examples of that throughout me cutting off these roots, and you'll just want to put those roots aside. Here's a good example. If you see a root, let me make it a bit brighter. If you see a root that is green and alive, but then it starts to get brown, that's okay. You just want to cut the brown part almost to the end, not all the way to the end. As you can see, I'm still going to leave a bit of brown, because if I cut off all the brown, then the green part will have to callus again, which basically means it'll have to kind of grow a scab over it. And if it doesn't do that in time, that root can actually rot. All right, so I've picked off all the dead roots. Now, something that may concern you is if you see white roots at the bottom or really light green roots, you may think to cut those off. But no, the only reason why those roots are green is because they have had no sunlight to photosynthesize. Once a plant had, if these leaves got no sunlight, they would probably turn a different color too. But as you can see, as it goes from the bottom to the top, the roots get more and more green because they've had sunlight and they were able to photosynthesize with that sun. So don't be worried if you see white roots. They are totally healthy, just as healthy as the ones on the top. They actually provide a lot of nutrients for your plant from getting all of the nutrients from the moss. And then another thing is that the aerial roots, don't bury the aerial roots. If you bury the aerial roots, it will actually kill the aerial roots. I actually have a video about aerial roots. It was actually like my second or third video, so go check that out if you're interested, and how to care for them. So yeah, don't bury the aerial roots. You'll know what the aerial roots are because when you take it out of the pot, you'll see them growing into the air. All right, so now I'm going to show you guys what we're going to use to pot them up. So I like to use something called sphagnum moss. I already have it in a container here. It's already all prepped. Before you use it, you want to make sure to get it nice and moist because that will really help your orchid to dig its roots into it. So you'll want to either put it in a big container like I have here and wet it under a faucet or something and let it sit for a couple days and then let all the water drain out. Or you could just take a little bowl and soak however much you want. And soak however much is needed for that orchid. But I just like to do it kind of in bulk, this way I have it. So what I'm going to be using today for potting up this orchid is this plastic pot. Plastic pots are pretty good for orchids. I like to always have 4 or more drainage holes to allow water to drain out of the pot, and it prevents root rot. I am also using these bark chips, these orchid bark chips for the top layer. And then now what I'm going to do is take some of my moss, make a small layer on the bottom of the pot, just enough to cover it, maybe about 1 inch or 2. Then you're going to place your orchid. And now this pretty much depends on how big your orchid is, so I'm going to just test it out. So yeah, I think my orchid could go a little deeper, so I'm going to take out some of the moss already. All right, now let's see how my orchid looks in here. Yeah, that's much better. It's really actually okay if you leave some roots exposed. Unlike aerial roots, if you leave roots that were under the soil out, they will actually turn into aerial roots. So if you can't fit all the roots in the pot, that's okay. They'll actually grow out into the air to get nutrients from the air. So now I'm just gonna pack some, well, not pack. When you put your growing media around your orchid, preferably sphagnum moss, because it retains moisture very well. You don't really want to pack it in. You want to kind of lightly place it because your orchid's roots, in the wild, your orchids actually grow on trees, and so they don't have any growing media really. They just grow into the bark and stuff, so they don't really get a lot of, they're not really packed in and stuff, so you want to kind of just place it because you don't want them to be, suffocated from the air. But that being said, you don't want to have it so lightly placed that your orchid will kind of wobble around and stuff. You still want to put a nice generous amount of moss. Because also remember, this moss is your orchid's food source. Even though it's just, a potting media, your orchid will actually feed off of this moss and grow into it. Try to actually get it inside of the roots, like in between the roots and inside to the middle of the root structure. This way your orchid can produce more roots on the inside and not just on the outside. All right, so now that we have finished our moss layer, we're actually gonna take some bark chips, and these don't need to be soaked. They could be put in dry. Just take a nice handful. What I'm gonna do is just sprinkle them on top, because I think it looks nicer to have bark chips rather than moss being seen. Now, once you are satisfied with how much of whatever you put in the pot, whether it was bark chips, leca, or sphagnum moss or some other type of moss, you will want to just pat it down a bit and just kind of tap it on the table or wherever you're doing it on, just to make sure you have all those little crevices filled up. You never, ever, ever want to repot any of your orchids with soil, with potting mix. That will immediately kill them. They do terrible in potting mix. It retains way too much moisture. There's no way for the orchid to get air. So you always want to use a light, airy substrate for your orchids. And the last thing I'm going to do is water it in. I'll be right back. Alrighty, so I just got it watered in. And when you water your orchid right after repotting, you really want to give it an extremely generous amount of water. Think about how much water to give your orchid right now. Think about it. All right, you've thought about it? All right, now give it 2 times more than you just thought, because you really want it to get through all that moss. Moss absorbs water fairly quickly, so you want really to get all the way to the bottom until you see it draining out. Another way you can water your orchid after repotting is put it in a larger bowl and fill that bowl up with water and allow your orchid to soak there for maybe 15-20 minutes. You can never really overwater your orchid. I like to water them every week or so. I also have a video about watering your orchids with ice versus water that you guys can check out. I made it a couple weeks ago. If you're interested, you can check that out. But other than that, I think that's all that really has to be covered with orchids. If you're a beginner with orchids, I have a full orchid care guide on my channel as well if you want to check it out. As well as, like I said, aerial root care, watering, sunlight, fertilizing, whatever you can think of, how to clean leaves. I just made that video a couple days ago, so whatever you guys are interested in, please go check that out on my channel. Other than that, I think that's it. So if you guys enjoyed this video, please remember to share it with your friends and family or anyone who you think will appreciate it. And other than that, happy growing. Bye, guys.